High inflation is not only an economic issue but also a welfare problem because it affects people's daily lives. The report looked at high inflation in the United States after COVID-19 and explained why it happened. It explained the key economic problems, uses simple models to expand and it gives possible policy to reduce inflation.
Now I will talk about how inflation changed in the US after COVID-19. On the left, we can see the year-on-year percentage change of CPI and core CPI. Both lines rose sharply after 2021. Highline CPI reached 9.1% in June 2022, which was the highest level in about 40 years. Even when food and energy are removed, core CPI still increased to around 6%. This shows that inflation was broad-based and affected many parts of the economy, not just a few sectors. On the left, we can also see the main forces driving price up. On the demand side, the labor market was very tight. Unemployment dropped to 3.5%, and wages increased from 3.6 to 7.4%. This gave households more spending power and pushed demand higher. On the supply side, global shocks raised production costs. The Russia-Ukraine conflict caused energy prices to rise by over 40%, and food prices increased by around 10%. Supply shortage also pushed used car prices up by nearly 45%. Together, these higher costs were passed on to customers, creating strong cost push inflation.
During the early stage of pandemic, both labor demand and labor supply fell as firms paused hiring and many workers exited the labor force. When the economy reopened, labor demand rebounded quickly, but labor supply recovered much more slowly. This imbalance pushed wages up and drove unemployment down to around 4%. Higher labor costs, especially in service industries, created significant cost push inflation and kept core inflation elevated. Next, the Phillips curve helps explain how this tight labor market translated into higher prices. Between 2021 and 2023, wage growth increased from about 3.6% to 6.6%, consistent with low unemployment. According to the Phillips curve, lower unemployment raises wage pressure, and firms often respond by increasing prices. This drove CPI inflation higher. Because inflation stayed above the 2 to 3% target, expected inflation also rose. Workers then demanded even higher wages, creating the risk of a wage price spiral. Together, the labor market imbalance, rising wages, and higher inflation expectations explain why US inflation remained elevated even after the pandemic.
The post-pandemic US inflation exposed several weaknesses in the current policy framework, and what the graph shows that is that inflation jumped sharply from 2021 to 2022, and by 2023 to 2024, the inflation fell while the rates remained high. On the monetary policy, the Fed extended at near zero rates and asset purchase initially stabilized the market during the pandemic, but eventually it lasted too long. And the fiscal policy included a substantial stimuli package, which are effective during the initial demand collapse, but it later contributes to economic overheating due to the ongoing supply constraints. And it is recommended that this inflation not rely solely on the demand suppression, but also incorporate supply side and structural policies such as enhancing logistic, housing, energy, and labor markets, along with the macro-prudential measures to mitigate financial risk and to shorten inflation periods as the interest rate increased.
Overall, the key trade-off is timing. Tightening too early risks harm recovery, but tightening too late fuels inflation, which evidence suggests that a blend of credible monetary guidance, targeted fiscal tools, and longer supply-side reforms will reduce the risks of future post-shock inflation and deliver more balanced economic stabilization. Specifically in the future, monetary policy needs a clear, rule-based exit path and data-driven communication to avoid unnecessary disruption when tightening, and fiscal responses should be more targeted, temporary, and followed by medium-term consolidation once output is near potential. By that, we can achieve the best balance of inflation control and economic resilience, preventing monetary policy from bearing the full burden of adjustment. In short, US inflation after the pandemic was driven by false demand recovery, supply chain problems, and overly strong monetary stimulus. Therefore, more targeted fiscal and monetary policies and a careful balance between employment and economic growth are needed to keep price stability.